Whisperer fans. It is DNC Convention Week, and I bet you've been having a great time watching all your favorite Democratic superstars do their little convention stuff. Now, I have to tell you, I can survive with a fake convention that's done on Zoom. It's not a big deal. The thing that I do miss, though, are all the old ladies and old dudes that wear the stupid hats and do the stupid dancing. To confess, I really love that. And also, it gives me such great lecture fodder. I always love showing my students little segments of the dancing. And I would have the Republican dancers like face off to the Democratic dancers. And my students would decide which dancers were better that year. So it's kind of going to be cheating to not have that for 2020, frankly. But I'll survive. So I hope you're having a good week. This convention special, obviously, was going to be, you're going to see, cut over time, over a few different days and a few different versions of Rachel. So you're just going to have to roll with that. I'm pulling together a couple of different interviews in this convention special and covering a few different topics. We're going to start off with a great interview with Jessica Post. And Jessica is in charge of the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee. What? You've never heard of the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee? That's sad. And that's why Jessica's on the show and also getting this premiere intro spot where people are more likely to see her. And that's because Democrats are trying really hard to flip several state legislative houses and chambers this election cycle. And if they're able to do so, because it happens to be the year that the census is getting done and reapportionment and redistricting is going to occur, they can actually use that power to subvert GOP gerrymanders. Do you know what a gerrymander is, right? And you hate them, yes? So you really do want to be paying attention to these state legislative races. Democrats have on this map, Michigan, Arizona, Texas, North Carolina, Iowa, all across in these amazing states, they have really competitive state legislative cycles, and they don't get any love. In fact, the last time our fundraising data was published, the DLCC got lapped by the Republican version of it in fundraising. So why don't we take a pause? Everybody go to the DLCC website right now and make a donation so that doesn't happen again. Because it's super, super embarrassing and sad. Super sad. I'm crying. You don't want to make Rachel cry. Okay? So we're going to talk about state legislative races and how the Republican Party used control of state legislatures to totally dominate your lives and how you don't want that to happen anymore. So you go make that donation. And Jessica's going to walk through her job there. She took over in 2016 in January, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, thinking, I'll just go through and we'll elect Hillary Clinton and have a great cycle. And it didn't work out like that. But she has had a lot of legislative election success. Could be more useful if she had more money. And I think she wants to tell you about that organization and what it does and how it does it. And I think you really want to spend some time on the Google machine after this episode, Googling up something called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and what it does and how it does it like a ruthless, clean, lean GOP campaign machine. Organization is just one of the many things that the GOP does better, state legislative election dominance. And Jessica's job is to help kind of catch Democrats up in that area. So it's a tough job. I think it's a great interview, and I hope you enjoy it. Hey everybody, welcome back. I am so excited to finally have Jessica Post on the show. I have been talking about having her on for quite a while, and as you know, we walked through a little bit about state legislative politics, why it's so important, how Republicans do it a little bit differently than Democrats. And so now we're going to have Jessica Post on to do the big interview and talk a little bit about what she's been doing so successfully with her steerage of the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee and where it's going in this election cycle. So Jessica, welcome on the show. Oh, it's my privilege to have you on the show. Again, Jessica Post is the president of the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee. That acronym, in case you're trying to Google it, is DLCC. And so this is one of the Democratic Party's major committees, actually. And it's probably one you haven't heard all that much about, unfortunately. Something that I'm kind of hoping to change a little bit with this show. This is a major legislative election committee of the Democratic Party. So you've heard of the DCC and the DSCC. The DCC focuses on House races, and the DSCC focuses on Senate races. Well, what the DLCC focuses on are state legislative races. And Jessica, under her steerage, has been running this committee for a while now. When did you start exactly, Jessica? Yeah, so here she comes in. Tell us a little bit about coming in January 16, and it's that's the beginning of the election year. So I actually probably suspect you came in with pretty high hopes, huh?
Yes. Well, I actually was a junior staffer at DLCC. I was the national field director in 2010 and 2012. So I saw a lot of these losses firsthand, and I really saw there just wasn't as much of a national focus on state legislative races. I ran and started Focus 2020, which was a state legislative focused program at Emily's List. And then the board asked me to interview and come back. And I knew that we had to do a few things. One, we had to increase resources to compete with the Republicans, but we also had to tell our story and make sure that we were able to compete with to compete with the Republicans at the state legislative level and get Democrats across the country really to understand the importance of state legislative chambers. A lot of our folks in states like Wisconsin and Ohio and Virginia, had been involved in state legislative chambers, but a lot of our Democratic donors who live in these blue islands of San Francisco or New York or anywhere sort of progressive across the country may not have been read in. So we had to do a lot of educational work. And so in 2016, we thought, we'll flip a bunch of chambers. This is going to be a great year. And we did. We flipped the Nevada House and Senate, the New Mexico State House, and the Alaska House, red to blue, in a power sharing agreement. But we lost the Kentucky House and also the Iowa State Senate, which was a tough year for us. It was definitely a tough cycle. And I think, you've certainly written about this. We definitely started to see at our level the true sort of political polarization of the electorate in these districts. In places where we had to overperform Secretary Clinton by 30 points in many cases that had been democratically held.
Yeah, that's amazing. We're going to dig into that in a minute. This why a Democratic state legislative candidate would need to overperform Secretary Clinton by that kind of margin to win in a race in the state legislature. So we'll come back to that for sure. So you come in. It's January 2016. You go through your first year of the 2016 cycle up to the minute of 8 o'clock in the Javits Center. Everyone expects Clinton's going to win that race, and then you come into the next day, and there's a lot of reasons to be sad in that moment. But for me, I'm already looking through that week, and oh man, there's going to be a major blowback to this election, and that's where my theory starts to be born. And one of the ways that I knew it would be born was in that 2017 election in Virginia. And I assume that was the first project that you were really looking at too, other than 2016. So tell me about 2017 in Virginia.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly there were two big objectives in 2017. One thing a lot of people haven't written about is we flipped the Washington State Senate red to blue in fall of 2017 also. And that was a huge election for us. We were trying to figure out, does the electorate change? The electorate in 2017 and in off years in Virginia had been much more conservative. And so we looked at Washington, where we needed one seat to flip the chamber. And we spent a lot of resources flipping a district that had been held by a Republican for a really long time, red to blue, with a woman named Manka Dhingra. In Virginia, one of the things that was so incredible was seeing a number of these groups come into the state legislative space and support the work. And so we were able to make significant investments and then support the Virginia House Caucus through the recount. There are things, I went and door knocked for Jennifer Carroll Foy in Northern Virginia at the end of the cycle. And there were things that I had never seen before at the state legislative level. 200 volunteers that had come down from New Jersey, a state that also had elections that year, with Indivisible, knocking doors. For me, it was just incredible to see all of these new groups and so many people involved in state legislative campaigns and really understand the impact. One of our partner sister district made t-shirts with the names of the women's state legislative candidates. And in those blue islands, like San Francisco, you had women wearing t-shirts that said like Jennifer, Hala, Elizabeth, and so many of the women that won. So it's very cool for me to see, as someone who'd been involved in state legislative races for a long time, this increased support. And then the huge win, obviously, gaining so many seats to be able to expand Medicaid in Virginia on the East Coast, flipping the Washington State Senate on the West Coast. And then the Washington State Senate passed a slew of good policies throughout 2018. And that really kept my tank going to be able to continue to do this work.
Yeah, it's really cool because, again, the audience for the show is hearing my perspective of that 17 cycle, coming from within the state, coming from a pollster, but also, this beginning of a theory that would turn into a forecast, and, seeing it from this weird academic, forecast election analysis perspective. And it's really neat to hear too how, Democrats start to realize, okay, we've got this donation resource advantage that we're not deploying well, and we should be deploying it more effectively by getting people to buy in to the value of out of district or out of area races, and why it's important for them to invest there and feel a connection to, why flipping the Virginia legislature matters at a national level, right? And it's kind of cool because I as certainly as a researcher, I knew that there was a thing called a sister district advocacy group, and I understood that to be a sign of increased enthusiasm, right? But to hear how it plays out qualitatively with the other side was kind of interesting. So, and then of course in the Virginia cycle, what happened with your efforts? You guys ended up doing and bearing fruit, right?
Yeah, we made one of the things we did in Virginia is we had run a number of special elections in 2019. And there was a special election in Delaware to make sure that we held the Delaware State Senate. And I remember there were 1,000 volunteers that had come down from around the area for this Delaware State Senate race. So many volunteers that during GOTV, you almost could have put a lawn chair outside of a person you were trying to get to vote, and like volunteers sit in the person's driveway.
Like the leftovers.
Yes, like 1-to-1. Exactly. Like, when are you gonna come home? So we knew early in Virginia, we won a lot of special elections actually in 2018, and so we knew that there were huge numbers of volunteers starting out. So one of the things we said to the folks in Virginia is we'll make early investments in field infrastructure, because look, the thing that's happening all across the country that you're not seeing is thousands of volunteers are showing up in campaign offices. And many of these campaigns were not engineered for out-of-state volunteers. We hadn't sort of seen that before, except for maybe in the Wisconsin recall elections at the state legislative level. So we had to create that campaign capacity. So when 1,000 volunteers came to Northern Virginia, the bus showed up in Woodbridge, they were able to give them the packets. Same situation in Washington. We made the same level of investments out there. And then the other thing, I think for example, at the beginning of the cycle, we weren't sure if we should normally you would say, okay, the election just happened, donors are complacent. So we had a plan, like a digital investment plan for Clinton winning. And instead I said to our digital person, I'm like, not totally sure what's going on, but I know that there's women marching in the streets right now. So I think we definitely need to try to acquire more email addresses. It seems to me that there's a lot of new people getting involved. And then I was experiencing that anecdotally, tons of unsolicited Facebook messages from old friends. I was showing up in places and, our phones were ringing off the hook. I was getting a ton of emails. People just wanted to know what they could do. So I think experiencing that in my personal network also was really helpful.
Well, that's really fascinating. And so between this 17 cycle, you guys end up, I moved to Virginia in 2015. It's got, I think, 3 of the 11 or maybe 4
of the 11 members of the House of Representatives are Democrats. You know, it's true statewide they're winning because statewide you can't gerrymander it, right? So they have Democratic governor, 2 Democratic senators, but anything that could be sliced and diced, you know, they're struggling on. And the state house, they're 33, I think, seats away from a majority. And you know, that 2017 cycle, they end up picking up 17 or 15 seats. I can't remember if it was 17 or 15.
I feel like I should know this. It's 15 or 17. Yeah, I know that we picked up a ton of seats. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I know.
It was a lot. So like anyway, the point is like they go from this like, you know, the distant minority to like, okay, like the next cycle is going to be this off year, because it's always an off year for state legislative elections in Virginia, but one of the years is the gubernatorial cycle, and then the other year is a really, really off year. It's a nothing but state legislative cycle. And so they go from this distant minority to only needing, they close more than half the distance in that one cycle. And so that 2019 cycle, you guys come back to Virginia and you are, you know, you need another, you know, a handful of states to pick up the state house because the courts have intervened in the state after 8 years of litigation. They have finally, you know, shot down these racial gerrymanders that the Republican Party used to dominate the state for, you know, more than half a decade. And so they've court ordered some redistricting maps that are going to pick up another, you know, 5 or 6 districts for Democrats. And then they have to pick up the rest electorally, right? And then they also are within shouting distance of a Senate map that has a Senate majority. It's never been subjected to this new electorate that's really jazzed up about Donald Trump. So tell me a little bit about Virginia last year.
Yeah, a huge election cycle. And I think concurrently in 17 and 18, we were rebuilding DLCC. So we were able to come into Virginia in December of 2018. We made $1 million commitment to the state because exactly what you said, we knew that the maps on the House side had been redrawn, and that was absolutely an improvement. It made the chamber much more winnable. And then the Senate maps, we knew that they were very close. There had been a number of Republican retirements, folks like Dick Black, who we'd been trying to beat for a long time. And a lot of the Northern Virginia voters didn't even believe he could be that bad and still represent the area. So a number of open seats really set us up for victory in the Senate. So we felt really good. So we made that initial commitment, and then we were now in a position to be the center of gravity in Virginia. And obviously, after the things happened with the top of the ticket, we commissioned a statewide poll that continued to show paths to victory, because the Republicans were trying to say, with everything that's happened at the top of the ticket, there's no way that they can flip the Virginia legislature. So we had to do a lot of work to change that narrative to make sure that people in the state especially believed that we could flip the state legislature red to blue with everything that had happened, and having a governor not.
Oh, right. Yes. Yeah. Yes, I remember. Yeah. Because you know, of course, my own polling and my own work was like, the problem for Republicans to capitalize on a scandal like that, one must also have clean hands on race, right? One must not have much dirtier hands on the topic, like any scandal, right? Whatever it would be. One cannot, you know, if you're going to capitalize on a scandal party, any topic, you can't, you know, lob bombs at a party on a topic for which your record is much, much worse on that topic. So it's a classic example of failing to be able to capitalize on a political opportunity because your own party is much, much worse on it. Yeah.
Real House of Glass situation. Yes, for sure.
Yeah. So yeah, and you know, my own commentary in the state was very clear that Donald Trump backlash much greater than Ralph Northam, you know, 1960s scandal. So
yeah, for sure. And you know, I think the other factor, I know you've talked a lot about anti-Trump driving turnout, which I totally agree. But it also drove an increase, and I think you've talked about this too, increasing contributions in a huge way, and also volunteers. So we had volunteers able to talk to people and make sure that they were making a plan to vote, especially as the election laws were still pretty restrictive in Virginia in 2017 and 2019.
Yeah, yeah. And so they flip this chamber, and I talk a little bit about this in the prologue to the show, and like the thing with the state politics, these state level gubernatorial and state legislative places, is there's no filibuster, and generally speaking, these governmental agencies or entities are still functional, unlike our federal government. So Democrats use that power to make sensible gun reform, liberalize small L, the voting access laws, and generally just pass logjam legislation that the public in Virginia had long been supportive of, minimum wage increase, that the Republicans had used their power in the state legislature to stymie. So all right, so now looking forward, you guys have laid all this groundwork since Trump's election. You've picked up seats here and there, and so you stand poised to do the same thing, or at least partially take over some one chamber of several states. Lay us out where you're on the offensive here in 2020.
Well, thank you. Yes, since in 2016, we flipped 10 chambers red to blue, including the 2 in Virginia, and then we flipped 450 seats red to blue. So we feel really good going in.
Yeah, I mean, that's half of what the Obama era lost, which was, by the way, double the normal, like the average, erosion a president's party suffers in the state legislature. The only time other than Obama's tenure that we've seen a 800 seat, there's 2 times. It was way back in the Eisenhower period. And then there was a time period, the Nixon time period. And when we think about Obama's time period, there's no logical explanation. There's no scandal. There's no, thing that occurs. You could argue the recession, the economy was not receding, but the perception was bad because how effective the right is on messaging. But, I argue it's the technique that Republicans use to electioneer, which I talk about in the other part of the episode. But yeah, so half of the erosion is fixed. And in 2020, tell us a bit about where you guys are on the offensive to gain back some of that other erosion.
For sure. I mean, quite a bit of that, of course, was gerrymandering. One of the things that we had not seen in 2010 was, as you talk about the extreme partisanship. And if you look at the numbers after the 2010 election cycle, we actually held things closer. It's really in 2014 where you saw the gerrymandered maps really take effect, 2012, 2014. But looking at 2018, we flipped a lot of seats. And so they got us a lot closer, similar to what you talked about in 2017 in Virginia, where we gained seats. It set up the table for 2019. We did the same thing in 2018 to set the table for 2020. So going west to east, we're really excited about the Arizona State House and State Senate. We're only 2 seats away from flipping the Arizona House, 3 seats away from flipping the Arizona State Senate. It's a barn burner. Well, it was a barn burner, but now it looks like Mark Kelly has taken the Senate race. So that's and then of course the presidential. Arizona also has excellent voting laws. To begin with, a lot of people voted by mail. There's a permanent early vote list in the state, so that's very helpful in these times. So Arizona's looking very good. Texas, where we only need 9 seats. You talked about this. Beto O'Rourke won all of those seats on the path to victory. We also have seen a exodus at the state legislative level where there's been a number of Republican retirements. And this is definitely a place where the Republicans are trying to put their firewall up. Karl Rove is involved with the effort to defend the Texas State House. So it's definitely.
Oh, is he?
Yeah,
that's very interesting.
Yeah, he's running. Well, 2 things have happened. One, he's running a specific PAC to protect Texas. There's a lot of keep Texas language, which I think is a little. And then in addition to that, he's involved with, or he's joined the Republican State Leadership Committee's board as well. He became involved with that again. So the Republicans really know the stakes are very high this election cycle, and they're doing.
Oh yes, no, that will make my trip to Texas 10 times funner. I'll try my best to track down Mr. Rove.
Yes, media savvy, right? So.
That's awesome. And what about North Carolina? I mean, so here's the thing with Texas, right? It's if you take that state house down there, you break the gerrymander. It's one of the worst in the country. So like that's really why I'm going down there too, is to talk about the context of that gerrymander down there. Because that was big news 10 years ago for people who are old enough to remember the Tom DeLay, gerrymander breaking up of Austin into 5 districts to punish it for not being cooperative to the Republican Dominion. So I love the idea that Rove's down there playing that. That will make it much more fun. So
He definitely is. Yeah, and the governor's all in too to protect the majority. In North Carolina, and obviously the goal there for your listeners and viewers is to make sure that we have a lever of power in Texas for redistricting.
yeah. Yes, I mean it's just critical, right? Because Texas, I mean, this time around is going to come really close. It could, if there wasn't so much other stuff that needed to be shored up and defended. It could, because of the pandemic screw up. If the messaging was on point, like Texas could flip, right? With money and message, I mean that's all it would take. But it is the way to hobble the GOP in the future. I mean, you kneecap them at Texas, and they really are struggling unless they reset themselves in terms of the small tent. They'd have to abandon the small tent strategy. They'd have to go Big Tent. So Texas is an important investment, I would argue.
Absolutely, and I think having a lever of power to stop rollbacks of voting laws and others.
Yes. Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you could, you need to stymie them in that state house. There's no doubt about it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think the Texas House Speaker is incredibly powerful. The Speaker does the committee assignments for both the Republicans and the Democrats. So having a Democratic Speaker, it's even more power than in many other state houses because of committee assignments.
Oh, I didn't realize that. That's good to know.
It should be. The challenge with Texas, right, is like it's incredibly expensive. Like and this may be new, but to some of your viewers, but state legislative districts, the sizes are different all across the country because of the sizes of states, and so these districts are both ground game districts, but they're also they're on broadcast TV.
Right. But the opportunity is that it's a realignment hotspot, right? I mean, the reason I was able to identify it a year out is that it's got this, it's Dallas, it's Houston, it's Austin, it's San Antonio, all of these suburban areas that have these millennials and diversity in these suburbs. And then these independents who are, they could be much more grossed out about the Republican Party with the right messaging approach. And what it just needs is money and investment and good messaging. That's all it needs. Just sitting there it's like having really good ingredients and it just needs the right chef,
Yes, and the candidates are great also. I mean, there's great Elizabeth Beck, Kiki Williams, there's women.
Right. Oh, some great candidates too. Yeah, no doubt. It's already got that too. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's another key ingredient. So that's huge. So a huge opportunity. And,
Yeah.
We're excited about it. And Beto couldn't be more involved. I mean, I'll give him a ton of credit. He's on the ground raising money. He would be out there knocking doors if it was safe.
Right.
He's truly done everything he can to mobilize his network. I mean, it's been very impressive.
No doubt. I'm super jazzed that Beto has decided to team up with my episode down there, help shine a light on some of these candidates and these races down there, and get my viewers into some of the hottest races down there because of the validity of them and it's just unknown territory. I mean, a lot of the reasons that we don't really know much about their capability is that they haven't been invested in before. And this is going to be a massive, I think, a massive opportunity to see what they're capable of doing down there. So
it's absolutely right. It's a huge place to invest.
Yeah. And I will tell you this too, just in general, like within the Democratic coalition, and this even extends at least in our Virginia polling, where gerrymandering received a ton of voter education. So it's really shocking if you look through the Wasson Center survey database. We polled on redistricting extensively. And when I came in and kind of took a look at our polling data on that, I was just really, really impressed, given how cynical I am about voter knowledge, at how much education our general electorate had about redistricting, and how supportive they were of reform. And so the fact is, like, I think there's a lot of possibility to get people jazzed about state legislative elections, especially on the topic of seeing control as a mechanism of ending gerrymandering.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think I have to thank President Obama for stepping out on this issue. I think there's been so much public education about this issue. In part, so many people came to us and said, why don't we if we won the popular vote, why don't we control the US House of Representatives?
Right.
And there's certainly been like an American education about that, I think, since Trump, which is
right.
which has been great.
Well, here's the thing, right? You've got a Congress that's set up so that the Senate is not representative of the population purposely. It's set up to represent states, and that's why every state, whether you're California with 38 million people or Wyoming with 500,000 people, get two senators, right? So that makes it really critical that the one chamber that is set up to represent people accurately actually does that job well, right? And so the perversion of that, and it's true that there's a natural perversion in the system based on where those populations are distributed. So it's never going to be the case where you get a perfect translation of popular vote versus House proportion, because Democratic population is concentrated in a way that Republican population is not. But what's happening to it now is a perversion of the one chamber that is directly and prescriptively designed to represent people.
Yeah, and it took so much litigation even to get us in the position that we were to win the U.S. House. And everyone knew what they were doing. I mean, they said, like, there's no better investment in politics. This is Karl Rove himself in editorials in 2010. And he said the control of U.S. Congress will be determined by races in West Lafayette, Indiana. And he knew exactly where all the targets were. I mean,
no doubt.
So people really, I get some slack for my admiration of Karl Rove and my admiration for Republican electioneering strategy in general. But the fact of the matter is, I'm a big fan of developing long-term strategic plans and executing them, especially when your plans don't, erode or mangle democracy and advance it, So, Karl Rove's plans were a way to get around numbers and people and diminish democracy. So that it's true that those are aspects of his plans that are not to be admired. But the fact that the Republican Party comes up with plans and executes them in the long term, I think, is something that Democrats really need to start considering.
Absolutely. I mean, when I would present at the same time or do interviews at the same time as my Republican counterpart at the RSLC, after the 2016 election, they looked at me and they're like, well, what did you expect? We've been punching holes in your blue wall for years.
No doubt. I mean, everything that they do is well thought out and planned. I mean, so when I talk about the difference between why Obama lost 800 seats is because that plan was hatched in 2007, and it was like, okay, let's take control. Let's have a really excellent election cycle in 2010. Let's do it by this, and this, and then let's use it to, manipulate the reapportionment process and redistrict in a way that will, crush the Democratic Party. I mean, you can't just, when your opponent is living and navigating the world like that, you can't just afford to wander through it like a Walking Dead zombie, because people are counting on you for their livelihoods and in many cases their actual lives. So it really behooves you to be answering that kind of strategic approach with your own version of it, in my opinion.
Well, I think that gives us the greatest opportunity in 2020, where it's the first time in 20 years where we've had presidential level turnout, and then also this new redistricting environment that we have to defend from.
No doubt. Yeah, I agree.
And so
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. And for us, there's an opportunity, in addition to flipping the North Carolina House and Senate, there's an opportunity for us to get to single party control in Pennsylvania. We only need 9 seats in the Pennsylvania House, 4 seats in the Pennsylvania Senate. Minnesota is probably the next Democratic trifecta. The Minnesota Senate wasn't on the ballot in 2018. So we have an opportunity to flip the Minnesota State Senate. And then in Michigan, like I said, we're only 4 seats away. And making sure that we have control of the Michigan State Senate. They now have a nonpartisan redistricting commission in Michigan, but that'll protect the funding for the nonpartisan redistricting commission and make sure that Whitmer has a lever of power going into the next few years. And then having that nonpartisan redistricting commission will set us up to flip the Michigan State Senate in 2022.
That's exactly right. Because once you get that control, I mean, the Republicans have used their control to suppress voters and make the institutional design of voting in states restrictive. And Democrats should use their control as soon as that they obtain it to make voting more accessible to people and liberalize small L those voting systems. And of course, obviously, institute fair and free elections and redistricting and stuff like that. So let me ask you this then to close out, Jessica. How can people support your work at the DLCC?
Well, thanks so much for asking. They can check out dlcc.org. We also have a list of races. If folks are specific in want to support candidates, they can check out dlcc.org/races. And that shows them a lot of different campaigns they could support. I also would encourage people to volunteer. There's volunteer opportunities on our website to do remote phone banking or postcarding for individual candidates. But the other thing I would say is the dollar goes so much further at our level of the ballot. And we really need folks that care about the long-term future of the Democratic Party. If you care about voting rights, if you care about redistricting, if you care about protecting reproductive choice and LGBTQ rights in the states, if you care about state legislatures, and that's really where we can see progress. So we hope people will check us out on the web or on Instagram at DLCC, on Twitter at DLCC as well. So there's a lot of places that they can get engaged.
That's awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining me on the show today. It was awesome to hear about the work you're doing and the organization, of course, which is supported by, I'm sure, a fantastic supporting cast too. And so a shout out to all of them as well and the hard work that they're doing to help your organization be successful. And so thanks for coming and representing them today as well.
Thanks so much. We're so lucky. We have a great team at DLCC, and I'm lucky to be a part of it.
I'm sure. And I hope they can all follow me on Twitter. So
many of them do.
All righty. So have a great day, and thanks for coming on the show.
You too. Thank you so much for having me. It's been great to connect.
Wait, you're back? You want more? That interview wasn't enough? You need more? Hammy, can you believe that? These people. And well, boy, do I have another hot interview for you. It was so good, Hammy had to watch it with me. And it is about grassroots organizing on the Democratic side. And I picked out these two groups for a specific reason. I picked them out because both of them literally materialized out of thin air post Donald Trump. And I wanted you guys to realize how not easy, but spontaneous, I guess, it is for something to go from an idea to the digital space to reality to literally changing the world just because somebody was pissed off and inspired about it. So what this is an interview with Ezra Levin, who is the co-founder of Indivisible, and Shannon Watts, who is the founder of Moms Demand, which is a part of Everytown for Gun Safety for the Bloomberg organization. But Moms Demand was started separately first and folded into Everytown. But Moms Demand is a gun reform group that has been extremely effective at actually getting gun reform done at the state level, because of course our Congress isn't going to do anything federally. And Ezra Levin's Indivisible is, I think, and I say in the interview, like almost, I mean, really has a lot of responsibility for empowering you, people who are watching this, no doubt, for helping to stop the Republican Party in its tracks, even though it controlled the presidency, the House, and the Senate, from repealing Obamacare. through grassroots organizing by teaching people how do you talk to your member of Congress. So I'm really excited to have the interview, have them explain how they started their organizations. Because again, I think that maybe somebody who watches this video one day will find themselves in a situation and realize how easy it is to become a citizen activist and change the world. So let's hear about that and celebrate DNC week with a little grassroots. No, Hammy, you're supposed to sing some bluegrass now. Ding 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 ding. Help me. So, welcome back to the Election Whisperer DNC special. I am so excited now to introduce you to two of the Democratic activist grassroots organizations, I think brightest and best leaders. And they're two fairly recent or new leaders in the party. I think they're just doing some of the most fantastic, forward-thinking and modernized work within the party, and it's supporting cast. So I'm introducing you today to Ezra Levin, who is the co-founder of a group you might have heard of. It's called Indivisible. And I'm introducing you also to Shannon Watts, who created a group called Moms Demand. And Moms Demand is also a part of Everytown for Gun Safety, which is Bloomberg's gun organization. So I'm so excited to have them on the show today to talk a little bit about what inspired them to go from ordinary citizen to citizen activist to creating organizations that are at the national level actually affecting, policy change, getting people elected. I mean, just amazing organizations that are having huge impact and, just a few short years ago didn't even exist. So it's going to be great. And I'm hoping that it inspires other people to action and other people to think about, wow, I could do this. I want, that's really what the goal is, to get people to understand that this is something that happens all the time when people get inspired. So with no further ado, let's jump into it. Shannon, I am so excited when I saw you give your first interview on gun politics, because gun politics for me as a mom has been an issue that has always been really important and really has hurt me a lot in terms of feeling frustrated. Like, why can't we go on the offensive? Why can't we? This is an issue that we should be winning. I mean, it's an extremist position to say, hey, everyone should have an assault weapon, and people who are domestic abusers must be able to have their gun access preserved. Why aren't we out there making that case? And then one day I turned on my TV and there was Shannon Watts, and she was representing this new group called Moms Demand, and I was like, oh, thank God, finally somebody's making a competent argument. And so tell me a little bit about how you went from Shannon Watts, mom and communications executive, to Shannon Watts, citizen activist of a very effective organization.
Well, thank you. I was a stay-at-home mom of 5 after having a corporate career, and I was living in Indiana when the Sandy Hook school shooting happened. And that's viscerally where it impacted me, really, as a mom. And I saw these pundits and politicians coming on my television in the hours after saying, oh, the solution was actually somehow more guns. And I knew that wasn't true. I knew that was a lie. I knew nothing about gun violence. I knew nothing about gun legislation. I knew nothing about organizing. But I knew that the country was broken when it came to guns. And so I went online and I looked for something like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, which I just thought I would join. And I couldn't find anything. So I started a Facebook page in my kitchen, and I thought I'll just have this conversation with other mothers and women across the country who are feeling the same way that I am. And it has now gone offline and turned into one of the largest grassroots movements in the country. And obviously, so many of us white suburban moms came to this afraid our kids weren't safe in their schools, and then realizing and learning so much more about gun violence and how it kills 100 Americans every single day, whether it's gun homicides, gun suicides, in city centers and rural communities, it's unintentional shootings, it's domestic gun violence. all of it senseless, all of it preventable. And, you know, to your point, this being an issue that resonates, I think, with women, our polling shows that that's true. And that, in fact, you know, if you look at the 53% of white women who voted for Donald Trump, gun safety is an issue that can flip them to voting for Joe Biden and Democrats and gun sense candidates going into November. So we are out there having tough conversations in our social networks and families. We're getting the message out. And it's also important to remember the suburbs are much more diverse than Donald Trump believes they are. He keeps talking about suburban housewives, which I don't know any of those. The suburbs actually look like America, and they have since about 2010. They represent the same demographic makeup as the country at large. So if he's betting on the suburbs with his gun extremist message, he's making the wrong bet.
Totally agree. I mean, you know, I have carried Sandy Hook with me every single day since that shooting. Especially as I had a new, I've had two children. One was, it was his birthday actually, the day of the shooting, and he is older teen, but my youngest had just been born. He was 1 year old. And so when he moved on to elementary school, I mean, the first day of school, as I'd watched him walk into kindergarten, I was thinking of Dylan Hoakley and the other children of Sandy Hook. So I know that other moms all across the country are very sensitive to this. And as a public opinion expert, I also know that Republican women display in public opinion data a much, just a quantified difference in gun attitudes from Republican men. So I know that, this is an issue, as you just pointed out, can resonate to them. So tell me then, when you started this Facebook group and it started to take off, at what point did you realize, okay, this isn't going to be like a Facebook forum where we, kind of vent our frustration. It's just going to be something in which it's going to be a vehicle for change. Tell me about that realization and how you kind of mechanically moved it from a forum to a movement organization.
That feeling really started right away. I could remember, my husband and I going to bed the night that I started the Facebook page and him looking at me and saying, like, this is going to be a very big deal. And I think I just tapped into the anger and outrage that had been building in this country, particularly among women and moms for so long. Even after Gabby Giffords, I think we all thought, okay, surely her coworkers in Congress will do something, and they did nothing. So, we realized we were going to have to be the people who did something. And so I was getting, I never imagined I'd be a public figure. So all my public information was out there, my phone number, my email, my home address. And I was getting letters, emails, calls, texts from women in places like Texas and the Carolinas and Alabama and Arkansas even saying, I want to do this where I live. And none of us knew what this was. We just knew that it was about getting off the sidelines. And we started really organizing on Facebook, chapter pages for each state. And we at the beginning had sort of marches and rallies, but very quickly realized what we needed to do was to be organizing to support good gun laws, to oppose bad gun laws. We thought at the federal level, we really did think, okay, Manchin Toomey, which was the bill Congress put forward, a bipartisan bill to close the background check loophole in honor of the Sandy Hook tragedy. We thought that would pass and sort of like we could go back to our normal lives. That did not happen. It failed by a handful of votes in the Senate, including some Democratic senators. And so our volunteers, many of whom are brilliant, just pivoted and started doing this work in state houses and boardrooms where they lived. And they found that there were governors who would act in the wake of Sandy Hook, in Colorado, in Delaware, in Maryland, and on and on. And also what we realized was that the NRA was insidious at the state level, and that we would need to spend a lot of time showing up and stopping their bad bills. In fact, we now have a 90% track record over the last 5 years of stopping their agenda, like guns in schools, permitless carry, stand your ground, things like that. And also, going after this from a corporate policy perspective. Women and moms make about 80% of the spending decisions for their families. So when we tell companies like Starbucks and Walmart and CVS and Walgreens that we don't want open carry in their stores, they listen. I mean, we just were able to get Subway to change their gun policy about a month ago. So all of this work, it was so much like lightning in a bottle. I think because we were able to tap into the rage and anger of women who wanted true change.
That's interesting. And, I'll be honest with my viewers. I specifically wanted you to come on the show, not only because of your really fearless advocacy for the position of sensible gun reform, but also because I had a front row seat to what the fruit that could be born if that advocacy was transformed on the front lines. So it's one thing to go to Connecticut, where Democrats already had political power, and kind of deploy that public policy advocacy into friendly territory. But here in Virginia, there was not friendly territory. It was a Republican-controlled General Assembly of both chambers, and your group, amongst other efforts, would have to take control of the Virginia General Assembly to effect change. Can you tell us a little bit about what you did in Virginia, a state in which the only laws that passed after the Virginia Tech shooting 10 years prior to now, give or take a year, were laws that made it easier for people to buy guns, not harder?
Yeah, Virginia is actually one of my favorite stories, and it's really a playbook for November and the years to come. I can remember back in 2013, right after we started, we were having to have conversations with Mark Warner to convince him to vote against an AR or against the NRA's desire to pass something called concealed carry reciprocity, right? So this was not a favorable state for us. It was very much a red state. But we did what I call the unglamorous heavy lifting of grassroots activism. We met with him. He eventually voted no. We met with all of our state lawmakers there. We showed up at every single gun bill hearing. We showed up by the hundreds in our red shirts all the time at the state house. And eventually we became a political powerhouse in that state. And so after the Virginia Beach shooting, there was a special session called. Republicans dismissed it after 90 minutes, refused to vote on any stronger gun laws, and we decided to double down. We outspent the NRA 8-1 in their own backyard. We spent about $2.5 million, but we also outworked them because we have all these volunteers there. We made hundreds of thousands of calls and door knocks, and ultimately, I can remember going into what we call the war room in Virginia the night of the election, and I was told, like, let's be happy if we flip one chamber, and it would be narrow. And we flipped both chambers, not just one, and pretty significantly. And then just a few months later, the governor signed 7 new gun safety laws. And so this is a great example of how you can tap into Black voters, Latino voters, suburban women, create a coalition, and truly make significant, substantial change in not too long of a time.
Right, and those laws will trickle down beyond the terrible smite of school shootings, which is, of course, what triggered your advocacy, to the daily scourge of, crime and shootings that are plaguing every metro and urban area, including here in Virginia. But for this mom, what it means is that, when my kindergartner came home and we were reading stories one night to go to bed, and he turned to me in the middle of the story out of the blue, as kindergartners are wont to do, and said, "Mommy, teacher says we have to be quiet or the bad man will hear us." And I looked at him and I said, "What?" Because it was so surprising to me. And he repeated himself. And I realized, between my 2 children, one who was born just after the Columbine shooting and my newest child, that this poor child had been put in a closet and taught how to hide in the dark and be quiet, because for those 10-12 year gap, that's how bad the gun violence scourge had gotten. It was heartbreaking, and I'm so glad that moms and the millions of moms that are involved in your group are out there trying to make Virginia and have made Virginia safer. So thanks for that, and I'm so glad to be able to hear a little bit about what you guys did, how you did it, and to hear that actually anyone could do it if they found an issue and a niche for it and the desire for change. So Ezra, speaking of, very similar story to Indivisible's roots, right? Because I know that, I've read a lot about Indivisible, and I've interacted quite a bit with your chapters, especially here in Virginia. So tell us, it's election night 2016, and it's about 11 o'clock. and you have a pit in your stomach. Tell us about Indivisible.
Well, actually, and just to start out, it is so great to hear Shannon's story here. I think it is unquestionable the transformational change that has happened on gun violence prevention in the course of time that I've been involved in politics is due in no small part to the role that Moms Demand has played. I mean, you just look at where we are right now, where it is within the Democratic Party, but also the public at large. I mean, transformation is the word, right? And that doesn't just happen. That happens because of smart, strategic people like Shannon decide to do something, right? Like, and it's just amazing to see. So I'm honored to be on this interview.
I'm honored to be on with you.
Yeah. So election night 2016, you know where we were? We were downstairs from where I am right now in our living room for the election night party that we threw to watch the results and celebrate Hillary Clinton's election. So at 11 o'clock at night, I think that was breaking up. There was some yelling, there was some crying. People were trickling out. People were arguing about, the primary or who didn't do enough to knock on doors. Leah and I had, every election, my spouse Leah, we go out and try to find a place to go knock on doors. So we had come back from the week before from the Philly suburbs where we had been knocking on doors, along with many of our friends. So we were shocked and in despair. I remember, so that night I went to bed. Leah couldn't sleep and went starting to make a list of all of the challenges that we faced. And our housemate, Angel Padilla, is a long-time immigrant rights advocate, was working for National Immigration Law Center at the time, was rightly focused on the terror that was coming for immigrants throughout the country. And so we were scared. And I remember I sent out an email 3 or so days after the election to a group of friends. I was a former congressional staffer, as was Leah. I was working on anti-poverty advocacy at a think tank advocacy group. Leah was doing anti-human trafficking work. So we're kind of like in this like inside the Beltway nonprofit industrial complex, mid-level managers. So we had been congressional staffers and then turned advocates. And what we were most worried about in the moment, I sent this email out and I said, there are 3 problems. One is, all of the atrocious policies that are coming at us from this administration and this Congress. And that's obviously what we do. Like, we work on these things. We will be fighting back against those things. But the second thing was more scary, which was the rise of white nationalism and fascism in this country. And then the third thing was maybe most scary of all, which was we seem to have a Democratic Party that was totally ill-equipped to respond to this rising fascism and was not treating the moment we were in like a unique moment, but just politics as usual. And I will remember vividly for probably some time the 2 events that set us off on the road of writing the Indivisible Guide. One was an interview on TV with a future Trump appointee in which he was speaking positively about the Japanese internment camps during World War II as an example of what we could do with Muslims and immigrants and refugees. And the second was an interview with incoming Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, in which he was describing how, well, we lost, we're just going to have to, cut deals. Maybe we can work with them on infrastructure. And so there was this really scary, quite potential future of 2017 where the bipartisan agreement was that the roads to America's new internment camps ought to be well paved. And we were shocked, we were scared, we thought something had to happen. And being former congressional staffers, we really didn't have any applicable skills, but we knew how Congress worked. And so we thought, look, we were on Capitol Hill during the rise of the Tea Party. What we can do is try to demystify how Congress works. How did the Tea Party effectively organize grassroots power in order to pressure their members of Congress? They weren't entirely successful, but they were somewhat successful. And right now, what we're up against is, yes, a trifecta reactionary federal government, but they don't have the people on their side. There are more of us than there are of them. If we effectively mobilize and use that mobilization to target our own representatives, we might be able to do some good. And so we started writing the Indivisible Guide around Thanksgiving and tweeted it out and was shocked that anybody read it, honestly.
Did they read it? Yes, they did, right? Not only do they read it, it starts like, a viral chapter creation and becomes a veritable, in my model,
really quickly. So, you know, and not literally, but figuratively speaking, right? So tell me about the moment when you realize, oh my gosh, we've created a thing here. Like people are seriously, you know, interested in this, you know, empowerment feeling. Because I think for many people, I mean, I know personally, the sense of being trapped in despair was overwhelming, right? So this indivisible guide, no doubt, for activists probably felt like something that they could grasp and hold on to, that gave them something to do.
Yeah, and actually hearing Shannon's story, it does really remind me. I remember that night, Lee and I went to bed, and it had, like, the guy had gone viral, which was cool. You know, we had just written a Google Doc, and it went viral, and that, you know, it was getting press that night, and we went to bed thinking, we did a good thing. Like, this is out in the world. Hopefully this will be useful to folks. And so we thought it was just at the level of a document we wrote was popular. And shockingly then what started coming in, just flooding in, were all of these emails from across the country, from Syracuse or rural Texas or Alabama, saying, hey, I just read your guide. We're Indivisible Tallahassee. We're Indivisible Montgomery. We just got this Google Doc. What should we do next? Because in the guide, we had proposed people start small local indivisible groups and call it Indivisible if they would like.
Right.
I think you are exactly right that the power of Indivisible, and I'm reading into Shannon's story, one of the powers of on demand is it's really a platform. It allows people to come in and say, hey, I want to do something, and it gives you an ability to do something. So what Shannon created was this amazing way for people who maybe they weren't involved in politics, they weren't involved in running for office, maybe they were just on the outskirts, they watched the news, but had never really participated in that way. And they said, wait, this is something I can do. And we experienced that with Indivisible. I will never forget the future Indivisible group leader. She's actually currently running for office from East Tennessee. She created this amazing Indivisible East Tennessee group that became a powerhouse. And I was talking to her sometime in the last couple of years, and she said, what was I doing before 2016? Minding my own goddamn business. And that is true of so many of the folks who came to Indivisible. I think one of the things that makes it kind of magical, it's not made up of the same old people who have just been doing this forever. It's folks who looked at the system, saw it was broken, and thought, well, damn, I guess I got to do something. And what they did is they started an Indivisible group, or they joined Moms Demand, or they did both. Many of them did both.
Many of them did.
Yes, no, exactly. And you know what, in terms of this, you know, intrepid political scientist lecturer from a little liberal arts college and with a little polling outlet running around Virginia, you know, moderating state legislative races that cycle, I keep meeting people, and they're telling me, you know, before 2016, before election night, you know, I barely voted, and now I'm running this Indivisible chapter in rural Virginia. It's got 400 members, and I'm running around Washington with a pink pussy hat on my head. And, you know, and I'm thinking, damn, this election's going to be a bloodbath for the Republican Party. They're going to get wiped out, you know? So Ezra, I happen to think that without your little guide and your, you know, idea to put it out there, and then to have the courage, both of you too, to kind of let the centralization go, to be willing to say, here, you guys in Arkansas, Tennessee, wherever, you take this idea and you let it do what you're going to do with it out there. I don't know that the health care bill would have gotten killed. Like, in other words, I don't know that John McCain does the 3 a.m. thumbs down, because that grassroots pressure that the Republicans faced really is organized predominantly by, you know, Indivisible and a lot of the disability rights groups that were super, super important too. But Indivisible played a huge role in that grassroots effort to derail the GOP's effort to overturn the healthcare bill. So talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the earliest fights, obviously, that Indivisible engaged in. It's worth remembering that the Republican House had passed a repeal of the Affordable Care Act literally dozens of times. It had passed the Republican Senate once and required a veto from Obama once. And so it was clear that this was going to be a top priority. In fact, the top priority of this unified reactionary Congress and White House. There was talk in November and December that, well, the Affordable Care Act's dead. It's done. Like,
Oh yeah.
clearly they are going to get rid of it. This is the priority. The Tea Party made this a priority. They fought tooth and nail against the Affordable Care Act. It became the rallying cry during the Obama years that this is why they needed to build power, was to kill this. And so not only was there talk that it was dead, there was talk there might be a repeal bill on President Trump's desk as soon as January, soon after he is inaugurated. And so we knew this was going to be a fight, and it wasn't necessarily a fight that we were going to win. We thought that the only thing that could work would be if people mobilize as much as possible in their own communities and focus on their own representatives. They've got 2 senators, they've got 1 representative. Make sure that they know that their constituents are watching. And so that was the plan from the get-go. The first tactic that we used was the congressional recess in February. So as many of your watchers and listeners probably know, Congress takes mini vacations. They call it congressional recess, where they go back home and they talk to constituents. Often these are kind of boring affairs. The same 4 people show up every time and have the same concerns. Every once in a while, a big issue is raging, and it becomes a little bit more contentious. And we knew that during the long congressional recess in February of 2017, we needed to ensure that people were making their voices heard. And so we spent January and early February preparing the groups for that. And what came, the Republicans in Congress were totally unprepared for, because there was just a massive uprising across the country in, yes, blue states and city centers, but in rural areas and exurban areas and red states. You have videos of Tom Cotton being just surrounded by people in Utah, Chaffetz, being surrounded by constituents, thousands of constituents who are demanded that they represent him. And, yes, John McCain played a role. He had that famous thumbs down, but I think it's a mistake to just focus in on just John McCain or just a handful of senators or just a handful of representatives. There were a series of victories that succeeded in either delaying action in the House, which was successful for several months, or ensuring that Democrats used the full power they had, the procedural power, especially in the Senate, to delay. That was a fight, didn't happen automatically. For ensuring that at different points in the process, different Republicans in the Senate voted no on different proposals. So this was not we got John McCain and therefore we won. That's the clean version of history.
Right.
A months-long, dragged-out fight where there were setbacks and there were victories and then setbacks. But it was
the one that I needed to use to get Shannon out at her hard stop at 3:45, though, Ezra.
Sorry, indeed.
Yeah, I think the power of Grassroots, whether it's Indivisible or Moms Demand Action or any other group, is about showing lawmakers something that you have to do over and over, which is, if you do the right thing, we'll have your back. If you do the wrong thing, we'll have your job. And I understand that people want revolution overnight. I get it. It's not the way the system is set up. And sometimes it is incremental change that leads to revolutions. And it is the hard work of activists on the ground that is never seen. And I always use the example of my daughter, who is 23, she's gay. She cannot even fathom a world in which she was not allowed to be with or marry her girlfriend. And that's good. It should be that way, but you don't get there that way. It's decades of hard work and heavy lifting on the ground. It's the point of activism. And eventually it does lead to revolutions, whether that's changes in healthcare laws or changes in gun laws. It's all a part of our obligation as Americans, even if we don't consider ourselves activists, but we have to get off the sidelines and get involved.
I could not have said it or wrapped it up better than myself. And what an important message to get across this week of the DNC especially. So thank you so much for closing it off that way, Shannon. And thank you both for joining and telling us about your organizations.
Thank you.
Great to be here, Rachel. Thanks.
Welcome to the grand finale of the Election Whisperer DNC Convention Spectacular. And this finale you've been waiting for is going to be fantastic. It is an interview with the one and only Cecil, who runs the most important Democratic super PAC, Priorities USA, huge super PAC. And you might be wondering, how do the Democrats end up with a super PAC since they hate super PACs and they hate campaign finance? Well, they also hate losing and not ever having power. And once upon a time, the Democrats worked really, really hard to reform campaign spending and make campaigns less, corrupt. And so they finally get this capstone piece of legislation through Congress, working with John McCain, the McCain-Feingold Act of 2000, and it's this big omnibus campaign finance bill. Over time, all this types of different, litigation happens because of that bill. One of them results in a couple of court cases, but the capstone piece is this case called Citizens United versus the FEC, the Federal Election Commission. And in that case establishes that corporations, unions, trade unions, things like that, could, because of free speech, have and create, separate from campaigns and candidates, their own spending organizations. And those organizations could not be regulated by the FEC and could not be subject to donation limits the way that candidates could. Candidates have very strict donation limits from individuals, 2,500 or might have gone up a little bit from that per cycle that they're running in. And so this FEC or Supreme Court case establishes this wild, it blows the top off of the campaign finance system. So if you're a little bit younger, you have basically, your political awareness time period has always existed in this Wild West super PAC world. But it's a very different world from the world that existed through the 2000s. And as it came in, the Democrats were like, oh my God, like, we don't like big money, but if we don't have one too, we'll get obliterated. And frankly, they've never really been able to compete well in the super PAC space, though Obama's and priorities have done pretty good. And in this interview, you're going to hear a little bit about how Guy Cecil got involved in priorities after it was running for a couple of years, and really, really increased its reach and what it was doing, and tried to model it a little bit better off of what Republicans ended up doing with their super PACs, which was to create permanent campaign infrastructure that could really keep Republicans competitive and ready to go. So we're going to jump into this interview with Guy and learn a little bit about what Priorities does, a little bit of what they're doing now, and all the organizations that they work with and what they are looking at for 2020. Enjoy. Welcome back to the Election Whisperer, DNC Convention Spectacular. I am so excited about this interview because I have here in the Election Whisperer hot chair today, I have Guy Cecil, woo! And he is the chair of the biggest Democratic super PAC, Priorities USA. And I believe it was commissioned in 2012 to help Barack Obama deal with this new campaign environment that suddenly existed post the big Supreme Court decision you all have heard of, Citizens United, in which corporations, trade unions, others could spend unlimited amounts of money through these PACs, but were actually called super PACs because they had unlimited donations. And on the left, this is a big issue because for a long time, money in politics had been a hot issue on the left. The McCain-Feingold campaign reform bill had been championed and really meant to rein in spending. And Barack Obama, actually didn't take public financing for his campaign election in 2008. That was a major change, and he had initially pledged to do so. And when he decided to reject it, that took a lot of headlines. But he was getting so many small donations, he actually would have hurt himself to do that. So he rejected the public financing so he could raise more money. The progressive left was not a big fan of the idea of the left creating super PACs, but I can assure you, Democrats would have gotten just absolutely killed if they did not. So Guy gets tasked with this job go create the first really big Democratic super PAC. And I am going to start the interview there because, it's one thing to talk about super PACs now here in 2020, 8 years after they've been operating. But Guy, you had no blueprint and you can't create it the way that the Republicans did because, it's a very different environment in that Republican super PAC world. And you have to consider optics. You just can't escape them. So tell me a little bit about this task that you're given to go out there and keep Barack Obama competitive against Mitt Romney in a new campaign finance Wild West.
Yeah, so I spent most of my career on the federal side, in Senate campaigns, at state parties, and at the DSCC. And I actually didn't join Priorities until 2015. It was originally created by Obama folks in 2012. And then I joined in 2015 as the Clinton campaign and the general election campaign started getting more attention for the 2016 election. And so most of my experience had been on the federal side, but I had watched firsthand how Senate candidates, incumbents, and challengers, and really in races across the country were getting outspent, especially early, by the Republican Party and by conservative super PACs and also conservative interest groups like the Christian Coalition. And, despite the fact that, every single Democrat, including me, would support Citizens United, the reality was we could not afford to unilaterally disarm, and we needed to make sure that we were taking the fight to Republicans, not just in the last couple of months of the campaign, but early. And so that's when I decided to join Priorities. And then following 2016, we actually expanded our operation and we included not just the C4, but also the Priorities USA Foundation, which is a nonprofit that is in particular involved in voting rights litigation around the country and taking on, in particular, conservative efforts to suppress the vote through legislation.
Which has become, of course, and we're going to spend some time on this considerably, actually, because I didn't know if viewers were aware that Priorities had moved into this area, and I wanted to hear, especially now, what it's like on those front lines, which is it's become so much more heated and so much more aggressive on the Republican side, beyond voter ID and to the point where, we're going to first come after the post office and then we're going to make it illegal for you to personally drop your ballot off in person, so you have to use this post office system. So, but before we get to that, okay, so you are watching then, at least from a pretty, important role in federal campaigns, running and helping with these Senate campaigns, this campaign finance system evolve, this post Citizens United system. And you're noticing, of course, that Republicans, because they have, this corporate world, which, has so many people with very deep pockets in it, kind of an advantage, right? And, you're watching Priorities. What was your relationship like with the super PAC as it first emerged? Like with the people who ran it, did you have any connection?
Yeah, well, obviously, in politics, we all have probably at some point worked one with the other. And so you build those types of relationships in the races that you do at the local and the federal level. But really up until 2015, when I joined Priorities, I had watched from the other side of the wall. And I think one of the things that folks don't understand about the advantage that the other side has, not just in terms of super PACs, but the entire conservative infrastructure, is not just on television. So much of the attention is on television advertising, how many ads get run, how early they get run, where they're getting run. But really what was happening on the conservative side was that super PACs and C4s and all of this infrastructure was existing 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. They were building permanent infrastructure online so that by the time the candidates came along and started advertising, the reality was so much of the groundwork had been laid by conservatives. And so that's when we decided that Priorities shouldn't just be a 3 or 4 month or 6 month out of the year activity focused on the presidential alone, but rather we should focus on building progressive infrastructure, democratic infrastructure that can compete with the other side, because that's where their real advantage was. It wasn't in September and October of the election year. It was in August of the off year.
Right. And so when you came in 2015, that's when that pivot happened, or did it come after the 2016 election?
It started in
cycle.
2015, but it really accelerated after 2016. That's when we decided to focus on Senate and House races and down ballot races. And we started investing in infrastructure. We started investing in groups like Run for Something. We started building our own internal infrastructure so that today, 100%, for example, of our digital buying happens internally at Priorities. We don't use consultants. Most of our creative work happens inside of Priorities. And we decided we needed to do some of these things to stay competitive with conservatives and the Republicans as they were building this infrastructure year round.
That's really interesting. Yeah, the reason I guess as an outsider looking in, I kept kind of honing in on Priorities is when I think about the conservative super PAC space, I could sit here and list like 5, maybe even 10 pretty vibrant and active super PACs. And when I think about the space on the left, it's a much more narrow field in terms of vibrancy. There are, of course, always candidate-specific PACs in the presidentials, especially nominations. But in terms of that left field, so it is exact. You're basically affirming exactly why I kept looking at Priorities as this big player in the space, because it was a very different. This is just one more manifestation, actually, in what I keep having a broader conversation about, these electioneering differences between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And in this case, as you had noted, this was a deficiency that was hurting Democrats because the Republicans were building permanent infrastructure that was allowing them, a massive mobilization and just a huge structural advantage that they could draw on. So can you tell me then, as you guys started to amp up, how many groups, or do you have maybe you don't know specifically, but which groups are you most excited have kind of been activated or brought into this infrastructure?
Well, I think there are sort of two types of groups that we work a lot with. You have, issue-oriented groups that are focused on a range of specific issues like League of Conservation Voters, which has been around and engaged in the political space and really over the last, I'd say, 4 to 6 years has significantly expanded their operation. But you also have organizations that have been typically activist organizations, on the ground organizations that have moved into the election space. Color of Change would be a great example. They have had such an influence on DA's races and have now moved into other local and state races. We work collaboratively with them. Groups like the Latino Victory Fund that are focused on electing Latinos to office, but also supporting candidates that are in favor of issues that benefit not just issues around immigration, which is typically how it gets pigeonholed, but all of the issues that affect Latino voters, the economy, healthcare, education. They're doing a lot of really important work in this space. And then there are new groups and emerging groups that I think are pretty exciting. Faith in Public Life, which continues to get more involved in this type of work. Black Church PAC, which is doing more political work this cycle. And so we get attention because of the amount we raise and that we've been around the longest, but there are a lot of really important groups that are building really critical infrastructure around digital and training and recruiting people to run for office that I think is building out the progressive and democratic infrastructure. We are not a command and control party.
Right.
We don't have $100 million donor that's building and controlling the right like the Koch brothers did for so long. We are building out and working with a lot of groups who are involved in this space because we are a more diverse party. And frankly, we had a lot of work to do after 2016 at the election level, at the activist level, at the training level, to really build out a lot of the party which had been ignored for a long time.
No, I agree. And I know that you and I have previously discussed the Priorities work on the ground in Florida. I know without giving away any trade secrets or any competitive advantages, could you kind of illustrate for people who might be watching and interested
thinking about how they might get involved, maybe money-wise, maybe personally in terms of volunteering for some of these groups. Talk a little bit about how these groups come alive, or these actions translate into direct, technique or whatever you're doing to improve Democratic campaign fortunes in Florida, which I think for many Democrats is a very frustrating state, because they look at it, and my model confirms this, as a state that they should be winning and yet come up empty time after time.
Well, as a native Floridian, I was born and raised in Miami, and so I share some of that frustration because I've been involved in Florida for quite some time, and I think one of the challenges in Florida is just the lack of elasticity in the race in the state. That we always have close elections. That we've seen, especially in 2018. I think there was a lot of frustration and disappointment at what happened at the Senate level and at the governor's level, but Florida is fundamentally a close state, and we can and should win there in 2020 if enough organizations, enough groups, enough activists focus on making sure that we are engaged in that state. And so we're involved in a number of levels. First of all, Donald Trump's digital operation got a lot of attention, some of it rightly so, and some of it a result of smoke and mirrors. And for the last 3 years, we heard about their operation and what they were doing nationally. The reality was that since July of last year, priorities has actually been outspending Donald Trump online in Florida, along with Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And so, first of all, our work involves making sure that people have access to the ballot box. We've been involved in 2 pieces of litigation in Florida. The first was preventing the state from banning public colleges and universities from serving as early vote locations. And the second was around issues related to early vote and voter education. Second, we've been involved on the digital side. I think there's a lot of conversation about persuasion and mobilization, and we think a lot of times these are false definitions of how voters engage in this process. I mean, for example, 1 out of every 5 of our so-called persuadable targets in Florida are Latino or Hispanic.
That's right.
We understand that in Florida, diversity in the Hispanic and Latino community is unlike any other state, that you have such a vast range of communities and people who have come from South America, Central America, Cuba. And so we don't treat people in these isolated buckets. We're just trying to figure out in Florida how to build the broadest coalition of fair-minded people who are open to a democratic message. We're obviously running television ads in Florida. We'll be up again in the fall there. And then we've been investing on the ground. In 2016, we invested on the ground through an organization called Black Pack. And we'll do some of that work as we head into the fall of this year.
Yeah, so that sounds to me like positive movement and a lot more investment than we had seen previously in the state. Now, I was of the opinion that a female person of color as a running mate would be an asset to the Biden team, even though it's very hard empirically to show a vice presidential pick in terms of public opinion data to call voters and say, hey, would Kamala Harris make you more likely to vote? Because sadly, most voters did not know who Kamala Harris was for the general election. Most people in the bubble, people who are on Twitter, who are following political news, people like you and me, but even further down in interest, just enough to follow political news, think that everyone would know somebody after a presidential primary. But the fact is that her name recognition is probably not better than maybe 50 or 60% of the general election. Now it's much higher, obviously. So asking somebody, you assume that, they knew she was a female person of color. And if they didn't know, how are they going to, show a race effect, right? So it's very difficult to show those things. So what do you guys think? You've been on the ground now for a week since the selection, almost a week. Are people excited?
Yes. And not just Democrats, by the way. I think a lot of times we get forced into identifying a candidate that might be good for one community or another. But I think what Kamala Harris's experience shows, what her electoral experience shows, and what our polling shows since the pick is that she actually appeals to a broad range of people. And I think she's going to be a huge addition to the ticket, not just because of turning out African-American voters, although I think that she will help with that, not just in appealing to women, although I think she'll help continue the movement of women towards the Democratic Party. But I think she appeals to a pretty broad cross-section of voters. And ultimately, I think as people get to know her, as we start talking to people about her, we're finding a pretty positive response. And so I think she's a great addition to the ticket, not just because she is a historic choice, but because I think she'll be a great candidate. And I think she's going to be a terrific vice president for Joe Biden.
That's great. And then to close out our interview, because I know that you have time constraints, you're trying to win elections. I do want to talk a little bit about that final new, and very important work that that your organization is engaged in, because it has been increasingly combative this last decade as Republicans made this turn, and they had to make a decision with the Republican so-called autopsy report that Reince Priebus authored after Mitt Romney's loss in 2012, where he cautioned the party, look, our rhetoric and our policy positions are becoming hostile to too many groups, young people, to Latino voters, and of course, to African Americans for a long time. And with the change of demographics for America's future, this is basically party suicide, and we should do a triangulation. And he basically gets, this causes Eric, in the mythos anyway, Eric Cantor to lose his primary, and the party decides instead to go, definitely the other way, and Donald Trump's the nominee, and so on and so forth. And that so ends the GOP civil war and the soul for the Republican Party. And now the entire brain trust for the Republican Party is going to be in my RNC special, which will be the next week after this special. So they move in part of buying this, needing to win elections with a increasing minority of voters into this voter suppression package. And I think it's important to speak about it very frankly, and I always have, even when it was more subtle, let's pass a voter restriction ID law, let's get rid of early voting, let's move polling locations from college campuses. I always thought it was very important to speak very frankly about what the purposes of those laws are doing. But now we're talking about much more aggressive techniques to undermine a free and fair election, which is the underpinning of a democracy. So tell me a little bit about what Priority is doing, especially as the Republican Party under Trump has ramped up to such an aggressive platform of election suppression.
Well, I think it's pretty simple. If you can't win with the electorate you have, then you try to pick your own electorate. And this is what we've seen happening. This isn't just under Donald Trump. I think one of the most catastrophic failures of the media is their lack of coverage of what has happened in voting rights and voter suppression over the last 8 years. This has been a systemic, widespread, national effort. In every state where there has been a conservative legislature and a conservative governor, it has been made more difficult to vote. In every state where there's been a Democratic governor and a Democratic legislature, it has been made easier to vote. And that is not by accident. This is intentional, and it's not new. I mean, when I worked on the ground in Arkansas in 2002, I remember having to call the press in and threaten a lawsuit because Republicans were taking pictures of African Americans as they were walking up to an early vote location. The difference is it's not being hidden anymore.
That's
Donald Trump is saying publicly what has been said in the back room for a long time. And so we're suing. We've been suing now for almost 5 years. We've been involved in 17 pieces of litigation. And this shouldn't be a partisan issue. We should be doing everything we can to make sure everybody has fair and equitable access to the ballot box. There should be universal registration. There should be early vote and vote by mail made accessible to people, and especially now when people are being forced to decide whether they're going to put their health at risk or whether they're going to go cast a ballot in person. And so we have committed $32 million over the last year and a half to voting rights litigation, and we're going to continue to see this process through, not, by the way, just this year. We're going to continue to do this as long as priorities exist because we think it's that important.
Yeah, so let me ask you. I think my fans, my audience, which is I think even sophisticated by political, punditry because it's so wonky and doesn't have a lot of, saucy clickbaity stuff. they're frustrated and they're frankly afraid, right? Because it is a situation where, where we're talking about, okay, is it a win if you prevent, order the post office to stop delivering ballots after a certain date, right? Do you call that a win of the election if Donald Trump is able to win the election that way, right? So my fans and my followers are really interested in like feeling helpless, I think. Like, what can we do? They want to be able to physically do something. And of course, litigation is a reactive rather than proactive response. So do you have any recommendations as for what people could be doing in terms of activities?
Well, first of all, I don't think there's any question that a lot of cities and counties are going to need poll workers. That we've seen in the primaries, and I think we're expecting into the general, it's going to be more difficult to recruit poll workers, those that actually check people in, make sure that people are eligible, give them their ballot, because we know that there could be additional outbreak of the coronavirus. And so if you have an opportunity to volunteer, or in some cases it's a paid position to become a poll worker, you should do that. You can go to the DNC website or Biden's website. You can sign up to volunteer to be a poll watcher. There's going to be litigation, lawyers that are going to be needed to make sure that we're combating whatever the Republicans are doing leading up to Election Day and potentially even after. So be sure when you sign up at the DNC site or Joe Biden's site that you're saying that you want to be involved in this work. And the last thing you can do is you can go to Fair Fight, which is Stacey Abrams' group. You can make a contribution to Fair Fight. They are the single most important entity in terms of fighting voter suppression and making sure people have access to the ballot box. So if you can chip in $5, $100 to Fair Fight, you should do that. You should sign up to volunteer. The work they are doing is really important. Priorities is a supporter of Fair Fight. Stacey sits on our board, and I couldn't recommend them more in terms of figuring out ways that you can engage and volunteer for the election.
That's great, Guy. I wanted to close with that because it's just so important for people to understand. I think a lot of people, I know myself included, had planned to vote by mail, and I have actually, I'm going to risk my life and go into the ballot place and deliver my ballot personally. I'm going to vote in person because I want to just be sure my vote makes it there. But I do think that the poll watching problem, because the poll watching workforce tends to be extremely elderly. And in Wisconsin, in that state Supreme Court race that Ben Winkler was on talking about, only 6 out of 160 polling locations could be opened in Milwaukee. So that, that's a very legitimate reason that Republicans can curtail in-person voting. So we really need an army of 40 and under-year-old people to show up and offer to serve at this poll watching job for this one time that it's almost like a call to action. And I do want to just echo that sentiment that Guy mentioned. So
Guy, well, and I would just mention, if you are, if you want to vote by mail, make sure you get that request in and just return your ballot as soon as you get it.
Yeah,
and I think this
track
is the,
it.
Yeah, don't
yeah.
wait until the last week. Don't wait until the last couple of days. As soon as you get that ballot, make sure you fill it out, put it back in the mail. And I think, this is just a difference between our side and theirs. And this, going back to this idea, the way that we win this election is by making sure we're reaching out to as broad a coalition as possible. Mm-hmm. The reality is we have a real opportunity here, not just to win this election, but to win broadly, to make sure we're picking up House seats and Senate seats, and to win the presidency, to win state House seats, to win the couple of governor seats that we know are going to be competitive. And the way that we do that is by building that coalition. We need to be reaching out to the third generation Cuban American in Miami, to the fourth generation farmer in Wisconsin that is going through bankruptcy and real challenges to keep the farm afloat because of this administration. We need to reach out to women in the suburbs, whether they're African American or white or AAPI. The way that we win is by building a broad coalition. And that's the way we're going to govern too once Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are elected. And so, we want to make sure everybody has access to that ballot box. This is not just about making sure that particular people have access or particular parts of states have access. We want people to get out and vote. And we know it's not just a matter of what's right and wrong, although that's true. We know that when people turn out of all types, of all backgrounds, that Democrats have a chance to win and to transform the country, to take care of people who just want to live into their God-given potential. They just want a fair shake. They just want an opportunity to be able to achieve their goals and their dreams. And that's what we need to be focused on. You know, this has been, as I'm sure for a lot of people, a pretty exhausting couple of years. It's been frustrating. It's been agonizing in some cases. It's been angering in some cases. I pretty much feel all of those things on a regular basis. But we've got a couple months left, and we just need to continue to do everything possible to make sure that we defeat Donald Trump and that we win up and down the ballot. And so I just want to make sure, if you haven't had a chance to volunteer, there's a lot of great organizations out there. Sign up, volunteer, chip in $5, get your ballot in early. Let's make sure that we're doing everything we can to win.
Yep, and don't let this pandemic stand in the way, because I can promise you that the GOP has not missed a beat, and that's because, you know, they're not as worried about the pandemic, so they're out there knocking doors and holding rallies, and we just don't. As a social scientist, we just don't know what kind of effects that's going to have. So let's just do what you can do. Guy, I couldn't have said it better myself. What a perfect way to cash out my DNC special. I can't thank you enough for coming on and talking about the organization and telling us about the good work it's doing and all the good work that all these organizations are doing for democracy. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Wow, what an interview. I knew that was going to be a great interview. I knew it was going to have a lot of valuable information in for the audience and a lot of insight, because, you know, usually when Guy goes on TV, it's to talk about a political issue or to talk about someone else, and I thought it would be great to hear about him and his organization. So that's it. That's the DNC special. It was a long one. I hope that everybody enjoyed the interviews. Again, this is an election nerd Disneyland show for wonks. So you kind of have to be wonky to want to hear and get into all these weedy conversations about the world of politics and politicking. The RNC special is going to be so amazing. I'm so excited. It's going to be very different, though. It is going to be one group conversation with a host of Republican exiles, expats, and renegades. I have got a veritable who's who of never Trump, and, you know, some people who don't describe themselves as never Trumpers. But I've got Michael Steele kind of co-hosting the episode with me, and we're going to have a group conversation with, let me see if I can think of everybody all at once. Joe Walsh, who was kind of a latecomer. He voted for Trump. He supported Trump through the election and then left Donald Trump. Once it was obvious that Donald Trump was a anti-constitutional, anti-institutionalist, and it was his break was very public. I have Bill Crystal, who is a famous, very popular on the left. My audience just loves Bill Crystal. Bill Crystal is a what we would call a neoconservative, very prominent in the Bush administration, very a prolific conservative columnist and writer. And, he broke with the Republican Party on the nomination of Donald Trump and did not support Trump at all. Same as Tom Crystal. Tom Crystal is also a prolific conservative opinion writer and conservative intellectual. Tom's also a professor at the Naval War College, and I'm excited to have him on as well. I also have Stuart Stevens, who I am personally really delighted to be getting to know. Stuart Stevens is a co-founder of the Lincoln Project. He has served on 5 Republican presidential campaigns, because they won the nomination in 5 and then won the whole thing in 2 of those presidential campaigns. That's impressive. And he is now working diligently to defeat not only Donald Trump, but the Senate Republicans, any Republican really, and really defeat the entire GOP as it exists today. And he has a new book out called It Was All Lies, how the Republican Party became the party of Donald Trump. I so recommend that you read this book. Not only is it really it's so personally compelling to hear this man who's in his 60s, who loved his political party, who believed in it the way that you believe in yours, go through this personal loss of that, but also to have so many of the things I talk about electioneering and Republican techniques and how they do campaigning kind of affirmed and talked about in a personal narrative way. So it's a great book, and I really recommend that you pick it up. Let's see. All right. So I've got Michael Singleton, who is a younger Republican. He's actually an African American Republican, so I'll just say that. So that's a party that is not known for its diversity. Michael has hung with Donald Trump and the party. He's not a big fan of Donald Trump, obviously, but he's hung with the Republican Party all the way through until recently. He did post up a few weeks ago that he just couldn't take it anymore. And that was, of course, over Trump's reaction to the George Floyd murders and to the protest in the streets of America over race. And so I'm sure Michael will be on the show. I'm so excited to have him. Just an amazing human being, super deep thinker, and just a profoundly cool individual. I've got Jennifer Rubin, the queen is what I call her. And boy, there is nobody that roasts Donald Trump better on the opinion pages of this nation's newspapers than the queen herself. So it's going to be fantastic to have her. She never hesitated when Trump came along. She took one look at him and was like, not for me. And when the GOP was like, yeah, we like him, she was like, okay, then I quit it. So I love her. I love Jen Rubin. And I have not ever had a chance to hang out with her. So I'm going to really have to resist not talking to her a whole lot. And I'll just have to talk to her some other time separately. So I've got Jen Rubin and I've got Stuart Stevens. And last but certainly not least, I have two people you may not know as well. And I'm really excited to have them on. The first is Sarah Longwell, who is this amazing and brilliant Republican campaign consultant. Well, former, I think, or maybe expat. I can't keep them all straight. Some are exiles and some are quitters forever. But Sarah is working really, really hard to convert Republican voters to vote against Donald Trump. And she has an organization called, you might have heard of, Republican Voters Against Trump. And she is getting Republicans to submit videos of themselves, testimonials, talking about their own personal reasons why they're going to vote for Joe Biden. And then they turn those into ads and campaign videos. It's very compelling work. I love the work that Sarah's doing over there with Republican Voters Against Trump. And so I'm excited to have her on. Of course, she's been doing many other things in the 4 years that she's been fighting this administration on behalf of her own political party, which of course has been hijacked. So, and then last but very not least is my who I consider my personal mentor and my dear friend, Jerry Taylor, who is president of the Niskanen Center where I work. And the Niskanen Center itself, which is just this amazing place to work, is a think tank of, it's not a moderate think tank, it's not a nonpartisan think tank. It is a unstructured, unclassified, wonderful, nebulous, uncharacterized think tank where science, data, and pragmatism defines everything. And Jerry is the guy that kind of pulls it all together. And I love Jerry's story because it's amazing. And the reason why everyone thinks we're a libertarian think tank is that Jerry was once, believe it, I'm not shitting you, the president of the Cato Institute. What? Why? I'm telling you, I love this man. And he was the president of the Cato Institute. But he is very, very, very smart. Very, very smart. And as he got older and things became, he started to look at things. The Republican Party became, a little bit more nutty. He was like, this is not right. And he had this personal odyssey that you can listen to on a podcast. If you just Google Jerry Taylor, I think Bulwark podcast. He's on a few podcasts. It's an amazing story. Listening to how he, once science and data and policy and people didn't add up, he went with where the data went, right? And it's just such a great story. And he's a great human being. So I'm excited to have him on. So that is going to be the RNC convention special. We're going to have a group conversation and we're going to talk about what it's like to lose one's political party. What is it like to see
something that you've invested your entire life in, something that you believed in deeply, something you're actually a leader in. I mean, these are just your rank and file Republicans. Stuart Stevens and Bill Kristol. I mean, these are people that I studied for years. I never in a million years thought I'd be working with Stuart Stevens and Bill Kristol to save America. That's Looney Tunes, but we're doing it. And it's because of what happened to the Republican Party, what's still happening to the Republican Party. And that's part of a broader story of what's happening to America. And friends, I have to tell you, the Democratic Party is not immune, okay? There are things happening systemically that affect everybody in sickness. So, it's something that you should pay attention to, in other words, even if you don't particularly like the messengers. But I do also hope that you'll watch it so that you'll learn a little bit about these people that, the world isn't black and white, and maybe Bill Kristol has parts of him that you can like. So I hope you tune in. It's going to be a great episode, and I'm excited to have it.